The sound of thundering hooves that reverberated through the tranquil Virginia air on the morning of June 9th, 1863, signaled the onset of the largest cavalry battle ever fought on American soil. By the end of the day, the once untarnished reputation of the Confederate cavalry, led by Jeb Stuart, had begun to diminish. As the prominence of the Confederate forces started to decline, a new figure emerged, rapidly ascending to prominence: George Armstrong Custer, a name that would forever be etched in America's military history. On June 5th, 1863, General Jeb Stuart conducted a grand review of the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia. 10,000 seasoned veterans of the Confederacy paraded past the reviewing stand, executing various maneuvers accompanied by the thunder of cannon fire and the cheers of the gathered spectators. That evening, a lavish ball took place. These soldiers had enjoyed an unbroken string of victories against their Union adversaries since 1861, and they took great pride in their achievements and the illustrious reputation of their esteemed commander, J.E.B. Stuart, commonly referred to as Jeb. This moment marked the pinnacle of his command, representing the height of Southern confidence and pride in their military prowess. However, the splendid review of June 5th was notably absent. The revered figure of Robert E. Lee, a leader idolized by his troops, who was occupied with other significant matters. Undeterred, Stuart arranged a second grand review on June 8th, specifically to honor the great general. This extravagant event was once again followed by another ball. Such ostentatious displays raised eyebrows among some, who began to question whether Stuart's focus had shifted from his true objectives, captivated by the allure of military pageantry. The adage, "pride comes before a fall," circulated within the army, and these murmurs of discontent were sufficiently loud to reach the ears of Major Harros von Bork, the inspector. Throughout history, there have been numerous instances of cavalry units exhibiting a lack of control, often attributed to their remarkable self-assurance. As someone acquainted with several contemporary cavalry officers, particularly in Santos, I can attest to this characteristic. Notable examples include the Scots Greys at the Battle of Waterloo, who rather than halting at their designated target, charged directly into enemy artillery, resulting in significant casualties. A similar scenario unfolded at Balaclava, albeit under different circumstances, where cavalry was tasked with an impossible order, yet executed it with great flair and audacity. It is noteworthy that many cavalry units, especially light cavalry, tend to display this reckless bravado, while their heavier counterparts appear to exercise more caution. For those with a passion for history, History Hit offers an extensive collection of documentaries that span from the ancient origins of humanity to the audacious mission to sink the Bismarck. With hundreds of exclusive documentaries featuring unparalleled access to esteemed historians, History Hit is dedicated to providing history enthusiasts with award-winning content that is not available elsewhere. Interestingly, there exists a tendency among cavalrymen across various nations and eras, particularly light cavalry, to adopt a somewhat carefree attitude. History is replete with examples, including the Gettysburg Campaign, where cavalry units engaged in grand military displays that were not necessarily beneficial to the war effort. A notable instance is John of Gaunt's Grand Chevaucheur in the 14th century, during which he traversed the heart of France for approximately 4 weeks before returning to his starting point. The Confederate forces engaged in no battles, did not set fire to any villages, and accomplished little beyond perhaps impressing the local populace with the grandeur of their cavalry. It is plausible that Jeb Stuart, following the events of the Battle of Brandy, may have been inclined to undertake similar actions in 1863. There was indeed a notable element of showmanship exhibited by the Confederates, which could be deemed justifiable in military terms due to the morale boost it provided to the troops. The assembly of 10,000 horsemen under Stuart marked the largest cavalry gathering in the history of the Confederacy, creating a formidable spectacle. However, this ostentatious display on June 5th did not escape the notice of the Federal Intelligence Network. John Buford, commanding the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, stationed merely 12 miles away at Warrenton Junction, submitted a fairly precise report on June 5th, stating that all available Confederate cavalry was concentrated in Culpeper County, including Stuart, the 2 Lees, Roberts, Jenkins, and Jones. The Confederate cavalry, which concerned Buford, had earned its reputation through 2 years of arduous combat against a numerically superior and better equipped adversary. Nevertheless, it is important to note that Stuart's troops were not without their shortcomings. While they were indeed fierce fighters, they also exhibited a significant degree of indiscipline and arrogance, traits that could create challenges for the Confederate high command. This lack of discipline primarily stemmed from the fact that these soldiers were volunteers who provided their own horses. Their presence was motivated by a strong belief in their cause and a desire to serve. The Confederate cavalry's sense of superiority regarding their own capabilities is aptly encapsulated by the words of George Baylor, who served throughout the war in the 12th Virginia Cavalry. Although of English descent, by 1863, Baylor had proven himself to be as devoted a Confederate soldier as any. He recounted in his memoirs the response of the proud rebel cavalrymen to the arrival of a strict brigadier general. One morning, just before the battle at Culpeper, I was taken aback by the number of absentees during the roll call in Company B. I candidly acknowledged that some of these men had returned home, some to procure fresh horses, and others to acquire winter clothing, assuring him that they would return in a few days. The general then inquired if I believed they would actually come back. I responded with indignation, asserting my confidence that they would return, as they were gentlemen. The general, however, remarked that he would have some of these gentlemen executed. I mounted my horse and rode back to camp, finding solace in the thought that if any of those gentlemen were to be shot, then a general who was not quite a gentleman himself would also face the same fate. The Confederate Army, being a rebel army, has historically exhibited tendencies toward indiscipline, although this has not been universally applicable. For illustrative examples, one can look to the Jacobite uprising of 1745, during which the rebel Scots Highlanders, despite not engaging in significant looting on their march to Derby, often returned home when the situation appeared unfavorable for their cause. A similar occurrence transpired a century earlier at Sedgemoor, where Lord Faversham found himself confronting Monmouth's army, which had numbered around 6,000 just 2 weeks prior. He was left with only 4,000 troops at the Battle of Sedgemoor, as many had chosen to return home. One notable instance that comes to mind is the Continental Army led by Washington, which exhibited significant indiscipline in its formative stages. This period was marked by several major mutinies, including those involving officers, as they refused to continue serving under the prevailing conditions. Similarly, Garibaldi faced considerable challenges in Italy with various factions of his Red Shirts. These individuals, fighting for their cause, believed that their interpretation of their roles was largely a matter of personal discretion. This tendency is often observed in rebel armies. Conversely, there are also examples of exceptionally disciplined rebel forces. For instance, Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides, a formidable cuirassier cavalry during the English Civil War, demonstrated remarkable discipline. They would regroup after charges, prepared to engage again, showcasing a level of professionalism that surpassed that of Prince Rupert's renowned but undisciplined cavaliers, who often left the battlefield after minor victories to loot. Thus, one must exercise caution in generalizations. Typically, it can be said that both the cavalry and infantry of a rebel army tend to exhibit a degree of indiscipline. Nevertheless, despite this lack of refinement, the Confederate cavalry consistently proved to be a formidable opponent against Union cavalry on various battlefields throughout the war. They regarded the Union forces with overt disdain, considering themselves vastly superior, to the point of viewing the Federal cavalry as a subject of ridicule. Baylor encapsulated this superior sentiment in his memoirs, recounting the confusion experienced by U.S. Brigadier General White, who was unsettled by the presence of a smaller contingent of rebel cavalry at Winchester in 1862. The Union pickets and outposts faced daily assaults, leading to a breakdown in communication between Winchester and Harper's Ferry. General White, unable to maintain an open route, became increasingly alarmed. After discharging many of his larger artillery pieces and depleting a significant portion of his ammunition, he swiftly evacuated Winchester, retreating to Harper's Ferry. Although approximately 100 men from our company posed a direct threat, he portrayed us differently in his correspondence to General Halleck. The troops under my command evacuated the fortifications near Winchester, Virginia, and fell back on Harper's Ferry without opposition. Due to the confirmed presence of 3 or 4 enemy brigades in the valley, it was not feasible to transport all government property accumulated at the post. It is unfortunate for General White that he exaggerated the size of our company, inflating it to 3 brigades. In his haste to depart, he conjured intentions and circumstances that were not present. To a considerable degree, Baylor's feigned sympathy was not entirely unfounded, as the Federal cavalry had indeed underperformed throughout the conflict. They were easily frightened and quick to retreat. Numerous reorganizations and adjustments had failed to yield any significant outcomes. Just before the Battle of Brandy Station, yet another round of changes had been implemented. Alfred Pleasonton took command of the Federal Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, which consisted of approximately 11,000 troops in a lamentable condition. Upon assuming this role, I find it imperative to express my concerns regarding the unsatisfactory state of this corps. I am committed to making every effort to restore it to a level of operational efficiency as swiftly as possible. The performance of the Federal cavalry had become so disheartening that a common rhetorical question among the weary infantrymen was, "Who has ever seen a dead cavalryman?" This well-worn phrase had even been voiced by esteemed generals, including Hooker, who was notably critical of the cavalry's effectiveness. In response to Pleasonton's initial bleak assessment of the Cavalry Corps, Hooker emphasized the necessity of exerting all efforts to enhance the cavalry's efficiency at the earliest opportunity, acknowledging that the effectiveness of this unit had been significantly diminished due to a lack of system, organization, and strategic deployment. While the overall performance of the Cavalry Corps was lacking, it was not due to a deficiency in talent. With appropriate leadership and organization, the soldiers were undoubtedly capable of remarkable acts of bravery. Among them was the young George Armstrong Custer, who would later become a legendary figure in American military history. However, even Custer's youthful enthusiasm and steadfast courage were accompanied by a degree of naivety. In the early stages of the conflict, the inexperienced young men who made up the majority of the Federal Cavalry Corps were often outmatched by their formidable adversaries, for whom cavalry was an integral part of their way of life. He provided us with an account of his initial engagement. I found myself in the presence of a company of seasoned and veteran soldiers, all of whom were keenly observing their new lieutenant to assess his conduct in the face of battle. As we advanced toward the enemy position beyond the hill, Lieutenant Walker inquired with evident concern, "Custer, which weapon do you intend to wield during the charge?" From my earliest understanding of the ideal cavalryman, I had always envisioned him brandishing his curved saber and striking down all adversaries in his path. Thus I confidently responded, "The saber." However, had you witnessed some of the charges that occurred, you would understand my exclamation of "glorious war." At this juncture in that illustrious conflict, the Confederacy had yet to feel the suffocating grip of economic hardship. The morale in the South remained elevated, a sentiment that resonated among the ranks of its leaders. The esteemed commander of the cavalry against whom the young Custer would contend was Jeb Stuart. By 1863, Stuart was nearing the height of his renown, reveling in the public admiration that stemmed from the undeniable superiority of his Confederate cavalry over their Federal counterparts. Accompanying Stuart in Culpeper County were 5 complete cavalry brigades, each comprising approximately 2,000 men. They were bolstered by a battalion of horse artillery equipped with 24 cannons, along with an additional 4 guns permanently assigned to Jones's brigade. Brigadier General Wade Hampton led the 1st Brigade, followed by Brigadier General Fitzhugh Lee, the second son of Robert E. Lee. The 3rd Brigade was commanded by his cousin, Rooney Lee, the nephew of the illustrious commander. Brigadier William Jones, commonly referred to as Grumble, led the next brigade. Lastly, there was Beverly Robertson's brigade. Jeb Stuart, the charismatic leader of this impressive assembly, was a vibrant figure whose spirited demeanor and zest for life were reflected in his passion for music. Among Stuart's command was a talented banjo player named Samson DeSweeney. He was officially designated as a courier, yet in truth, he served as the vital force that infused vibrancy and energy into an otherwise monotonous military environment. A remarkable musician, he elevated the spirits of all who listened to him. Stuart had a profound appreciation for banjo music, and would frequently request Sweeney to perform at every possible moment. Wherever Stuart ventured, Sweeney accompanied him. Eston Cook, a member of Stuart's staff, reminisced about this individual. Sweeney, the banjo player for Stuart, was a permanent presence in his tent. He rode alongside Stuart during marches and attended social events with him. Stuart composed his most significant dispatches amidst the lively sounds of the cheerful instrument, captivating everyone around. He would often pause from his tasks, erupt into laughter, and joyfully join in Sweeney's melodies. If any instrument conveyed the essence of wild and exuberant joy, it was undoubtedly the notes of Sweeney's banjo. The spirit of Jeb Stuart was indeed wild and jubilant, earning him the affection of his men. Conversely, the soldiers of the Federal Cavalry Corps had limited chances to develop a bond with their leaders. The constant shifts in command, as the Federal High Command struggled to find a successful combination, hindered the establishment of rapport between commanders and their troops. General Alfred Pleasanton, who had recently taken command of the Northern Cavalry Corps from General Stoneman on May 22nd, just 17 days prior to the Battle of Brandy Station, faced this challenge. Pleasanton's command was structured into 3 divisions of cavalry, each comprising approximately 3,000 soldiers. In theory, they were supported by a division of horse artillery, totaling around 58 guns. However, only 12 were actually present at the Battle of Brandy Station. The 1st Division under Pleasanton's command was led by Brigadier General John Buford. The subsequent formation was that of Brigadier General David Gregg's division. The 3rd Division was under the command of a French officer, Brigadier General Alfred Dufay. Additionally, 2 understrength brigades of infantry, led by Brigadier Generals Russell and Amos, were assigned to Pleasanton for the engagement at Brandy Station, with Russell attached to Buford and Amos to Gregg. Despite his youth, Custer had already begun to distinguish himself in combat, earning the favor of the proactive Pleasanton, who invited him to join his staff. In return, Custer offered his unwavering support and respect to the officer. Upon my arrival at Camp Falmouth, I was called to the headquarters of the 1st Cavalry Division, where I was welcomed by Brigadier General Pleasanton. "Curley," he stated, "I wish for you to serve as my special aide. I will be straightforward. You are a man after my own heart, full of spirit. Will you accept this role?" Without hesitation, I replied affirmatively, and we sealed the agreement with a handshake. These were the distinguished members of the great cavalry forces assembled on June 9, 1863. This gathering represented the largest contingent of cavalry ever assembled against one another in America. However, by the 1860s, the cavalry, as a vital component of the Army, was already experiencing a decline. It had been overshadowed by the superior firepower of infantry units, and in contrast to the extensive infantry forces mobilizing in the lead-up to Gettysburg, the cavalry appeared relatively modest. In the Culpeper County area, Robert E. Lee had consolidated his Army of Northern Virginia, numbering 60,000 troops for a second incursion into the North. Opposing him was General Joe Hooker, commanding 110,000 effective soldiers. By launching an invasion into the North, Lee aimed to draw Hooker away from Richmond, thereby alleviating the federal pressure on the beleaguered Confederate capital. Following the hard-fought Confederate victory at Chancellorsville, the Union forces had opted to maintain their positions in well-fortified areas and await further developments. Despite the numerical superiority of the Federal troops, the Confederates were confident that if they could entice the Union Army into open combat, they could achieve another victory. Consequently, General Lee aimed to instigate a decisive battle by advancing northward and urging the Union forces to abandon their defensive strongholds. He understood that by posing a threat to the north, the Union could not remain entrenched and would be compelled to engage. While Lee would ultimately reach his goal, the results would diverge significantly from his expectations, culminating in the devastating 3-day Battle of Gettysburg, which marked the beginning of the decline for the Confederacy. However, prior to this pivotal confrontation, there remained the pressing issue of the significant cavalry engagement at Brandy Station. Once united, the 3 columns aimed to confront the main Confederate force believed to be stationed at Culpeper Courthouse. During a briefing to assist Pleasanton, George Armstrong Custer was present and later recounted the details in his memoirs. The general in charge indicated that scouts had reported Lee's movements along the eastern side of the Blue Ridge Mountains towards Harper's Ferry. This suggested a potential new invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania, necessitating immediate action to prevent Lee from crossing the Potomac River. Jeb Stuart was providing protection on Lee's right flank with a cavalry force of 10,000. The general emphasized the importance of neutralizing Stuart to hinder Lee's advance, stating that without mounted support, Lee would struggle to proceed effectively. He urged a decisive strike against Lee, advocating for a vigorous engagement to disrupt his plans. The directive was clear: mobilize the entire corps and depart the following day, with a strong emphasis on maintaining the element of surprise, which was deemed crucial for success. However, the element of surprise would not remain exclusively with the Union forces. Shortly after the plans were established, complications arose. Contrary to Hooker's expectations, Stuart's cavalry was not positioned at Culpeper Courthouse. Instead, they were encamped in the fields surrounding Brandy Station. The onset of conflict would occur much sooner than anticipated. Clausewitz, the renowned Prussian military theorist of the early 19th century, extensively discusses the impact of friction and uncertainty in warfare. This can be likened to the chaotic elements that frequently arise. Burmolka, writing shortly after the American Civil War, wisely noted that no plan endures beyond the initial 5 minutes of combat, as war is inherently characterized by unpredictability. In certain instances, such as at Brandy Station, both sides experience mutual surprise, stumbling upon one another and unexpectedly finding themselves in a military scenario neither had anticipated. A primary function of cavalry, as previously mentioned, is reconnaissance during battle. In this context, we have two cavalry leaders: Jeb Stuart, the most celebrated cavalry officer of his era in America, and Pleasanton, the commander of the Union cavalry. Each is tasked with the responsibility of scouting and gathering intelligence on the enemy's forces, only to inadvertently encounter one another as if by destiny. However, Jeb Stuart possesses a flamboyant inclination, aspiring to emulate Prince Murat. The cavalrymen of this era held a deep admiration for Prince Murat's illustrious reputation from the Napoleonic Wars, characterized by his strikingly elegant uniforms and his engaging performances, such as playing the banjo. This admiration encapsulated the mindset and ethos expected of a cavalry commander. In this context, both generals, particularly Jeb Stuart more so than Pleasanton, found themselves completely unprepared for the unfolding events. By a twist of fate, the entire Confederate Cavalry Corps had arranged to cross the Rappahannock River at the same ford as their Union counterparts on the very same day. This maneuver was intended to serve as a precursor to a strategy aimed at protecting the right flank of Lee's army as it advanced northward. Consequently, the Confederates were not positioned at Culpeper Courthouse, where the Union forces anticipated their presence on the morning of June 9th, but rather at Brandy Station, poised to cross the river concurrently with the Union troops. Thus, the stage was set for a monumental clash of cavalry forces. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our next discussion.